When it comes to discussing games online, you'll come across a lot of different opinions. If you ask one fan what they thought of Pokemon Sword and Shield, they might say it was the worst thing to happen to gaming since microtransactions, while another would give it a 10 out of 10 with a glowing recommendation. However, there are a few games where they are so critically praised, there's basically no question. Like, almost any 3D Mario game is going to be worth your time. I said almost. Basically, what I'm trying to say is there's a reason you don't see people posting videos about why Mario 64 is a 2 out of 10, or that Luigi's Mansion 2 was a disappointing sequel. And to stop beating around the bush, Breath of the Wild is one of those games. You could ask pretty much any Zelda fan what they thought of it, and even if they have certain aspects they disagree with, nobody will tell you that it's a horrible abomination or something. But with that being said, I never fully appreciated this game. Even if I knew objectively it was a masterpiece, it never quite clicked with me. That's not to say I didn't like it, I even got the DLC pack, but when I finished it, I pretty much said, wow, that was pretty good, and then moved on without much afterthought. Well, in preparation for Tears of the Kingdom, I actually gave it another shot, and that did improve my opinion of it quite a bit. But then something funny happened. When I played the sequel, I absolutely loved it. But when other people tried the game, it seems the reaction was a lot more mixed. Sure, many people lauded it as a masterpiece, but plenty of others seemed to be disappointed. So what changed? I think it's only fair to give the two games a comparison to see what made or broke the sequel for so many people. Without further ado, let's get started. Hey there, I'm Kardino. Let me start by getting a couple things out of the way. First, this will not be a critique of either Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom, because 1, there are people way more capable of dissecting those games than me, and 2, because especially in Breath of the Wild's case, they've probably already done it. What I am here to discuss is whether Tears of the Kingdom is a good sequel, because we all know it's a good game on its own. Second, in order for this to be a fair comparison, I'll be covering spoilers here, including the final bosses and endings. So just be aware of that too. Anyway, we'll be going over some major aspects of each game, one at a time. So first up, what better place to begin than with the opening of each game? Breath of the Wild starts off by dropping you into an unfamiliar world with only some old clothes and what is definitely not a Switch. There's no need to elaborate on just how genius the Great Plateau is. Anything you need to know, you'll either figure out on your own, or the game will tell you in only a couple sentences. Meanwhile, Tears' opening is much more exposition focused. Of course, you still have your shrines and a whole island to explore, but not before about 10 minutes of cutscenes. My point is that the tutorial is much more tied into the story. In fact, it's so important they give you a recap once you're on the ground again. Comparing the two, it's a little hard to say one is clearly better than the other, because the Great Sky Island is just the Great Plateau with a few extra cutscenes. Okay, maybe that's not completely fair. It does have some caves and different tools to use once you get your different abilities, but I think there's something to be said for Breath of the Wild doing it first. I don't think anything will be quite that immersive. I think Tears works best if you play the other game first, but at that point, doing the same process again, just with different powers, won't hit as hard. Let's begin this section by listing all of Link's abilities in the first game. In Breath of the Wild, you have Magnesis, Stasis, Cryonis, Bombs, Mipha's Grace, Rivali's Gale, Daruk's Protection, and Urbosa's Fury. This kit was certainly a force to be reckoned with. The basic set alone gives you a solution to something in most situations outside of combat, and even the Stasis and Bomb abilities could be useful when fighting monsters. But add on the hero abilities and you're even more powerful. Even, dare I say it, overpowered. The fact that with only a half-hour recharge time, you can instantly heal from any damage while adding bonus hearts is more than a little broken in its own right. Then you add the ability to block any 3 attacks, an AoE attack that can even kill some guardians, and the ability to get a lift from anywhere on the ground. These made fights almost trivial. The difficulty of this game became a joke, and even the main bosses became the punchline. Now, let's look at Tears of the Kingdom's abilities. Ultra Hand and Multi-Build are definitely way better than Magnesis, not to mention it completely changes how you get around the world. Though by the 50-hour mark, I definitely just had my preset builds that I used, and that's about it. Not that it's really a point against the game, but I might as well mention it anyway. Recall is sort of an upgrade to Stasis, but I will say there are definitely times when you just want something to stay still instead. Then you have Fuse, which is so big it's hardly fair to call it an ability like the others. There's Ascend, which would seem broken if it weren't so circumstantial. Then you have the hero abilities, which I like to call Yunobo's Cannonball, Simon's Bubble, Tulin's Gust, Riju's Lightning, and Minoru's Construct, which I basically just use to cross Puddles of Gloom. I think the biggest problem for people is that the hero abilities in particular just feel like weaker versions of the last games, excluding Yunobo. Getting a boost forward in the air is much less useful than getting an updraft, for example. And the lightning AoE has gone significantly weaker. Simon's Bubble is so weak it's almost not worth the time it takes to chase him down. Oh yeah, the fact that you have to chase each hero down to use their ability now is kinda lame. They always seem to be there when you don't need them, but running around on the other side of the fight when you think to call on them. But beyond that, I do have to ask the question, are these abilities really bad, or were we just spoiled by the first game? It seems Nintendo went for the approach of having these abilities be more passive rather than insane buffs. And that's probably to balance them with Fuse. I was actually looking forward to the idea of fusing 4 or 5 spirits together, but I guess that'll have to stay in my imagination. But what you can do now is take a strong weapon like a claymore and fuse it to a short sword, reaping the benefits of both a fast strike and 50 damage. You can even fuse stuff to the Master Sword. And that's not even mentioning all the things you can fuse to arrows. Keese went from being an annoyance in Breath to the most valuable monster in the game. Let's also remember that not only can you create whatever weapon you want and amazing arrows, but now the heroes fight alongside you. But of course, this also means that all the monster fights are harder. So, which game did it better? Well, while there are certainly moments when I wish I had Rivali's Gale or Infinite Bombs, I'd probably have to give the win to Tears of the Kingdom, just because I think it's a better designed game, even if Breath of the Wild can be more overpowered. I think one of the more universally praised aspects of Tears of the Kingdom is its improvement of the shrine system. It's not that the old ones were bad, most of the time, but some of them did feel like filler. The prime example of this would be the Tests of Strength, where there was just a flat room with maybe some water or a couple pillars or something. Then you just fight the Guardian, assuming you have enough weapons, and collect your prize. This time, they do a much better job making the battlegrounds more interesting and throwing multiple enemies at you at once. In fact, it encourages you to sneak around a lot more so you can tackle one at a time. And since they take away all your weapons at the start anyway, you know it'll be possible to clear the challenge, whether it be through fusing together a weapon or using an environmental trap. In fact, I go so far as to say that these were some of my favorite shrines in the game. I also like the tutorial shrines, which force you to practice specific techniques. I like almost all the Ultra Hand puzzles over the Magnesis puzzles from last time. And in general, the new shrines seem to just be better designed. There were a few old shrines that kind of assumed you had an arrow or source of fire on hand, which was definitely not always the case. Not to mention the dueling peak shrines. Again, that's not to say that all the old shrines were bad, but I just feel like I enjoyed myself in these shrines more. Sadly, I could go without the apparatus puzzles with their clunky controls, even if this is the closest Monkey Ball fans got to a new game on the Wii U. Okay, so before I start slamming Breath of the Wild's story, I will say that I don't think it was terrible. Actually, seeing a nation fall to Ganon was a very unique twist, and obviously Tears of the Kingdom story only really builds on top of it. Kinda. Plus, we can't ignore that this was the first Zelda game with voice acting. However, and this is where some people might disagree, I think living a story in the present is much more interesting than learning about a story that happened in the past. And Tears of the Kingdom as a whole felt like a much more interesting plot. I mean, as soon as you throw in time travel into any story, it's going to be a lot more interesting and inevitably opens a lot more plot holes. And boy, does this game have a few of them. So I guess now that Zelda traveled back in time, she can affect the future. So now there's a light dragon flying around that wasn't in the first game. There's a geoglyphs. I guess Ganon from the last game is still defeated. So that rules out a separate timeline theory. It just doesn't make sense. And the game as a whole seems to be very selective as to what Link actually did in the previous game. So a bunch of NPCs will remember you, but then I guess you never got any gear outside of the hero's tunic and the Zora armor. It's just kinda messy with continuity, so that is a point I will give to the original game. As relatively simple as the story is, it didn't have such glaring plot holes. But here is a detriment that I felt in both games: the voice acting. Or specifically, the lack of voice acting for Link. I don't even know why Nintendo insists on keeping Link as a silent protagonist. Even if he retains the default protagonist personality, this isn't Mario. You'd think for a game this cinematic, they'd have him say anything. All the characters treat him like this close friend, but when all he does is a single talking animation, I don't get how they can be such great friends. Especially Mipha. Like, I know at the end of some cutscenes it's implied that Link is about to speak, but it's really awkward seeing her basically just talk to herself the entire time. Like, you have this girl who was basically close enough to you to give you an engagement gift, just pouring her heart out to you after sacrificing herself 100 years ago. And your response is just to say nothing? That's just bad writing. Or maybe it was a one-sided relationship, but then that would mean that he accepted an engagement gift from a girl he didn't even care about. The best theory I could come up with was that Link only had one memory of Mipha, so he was tongue-tied when it came to conversing with her spirit. But at that point, that's one really awkward reunion. I think I got off track there. So basically, my point was that both stories are, I would argue, significantly dampened by the lack of having any kind of main character personality at all. But in the end, I would have to say Tears has a better story, even if it is fond of retelling the same plot points over and over again. I think the scene where Zelda basically sacrifices herself is way more powerful than anything Breath of the Wild threw at me. Though I will admit, seeing Zelda's character development was nice there. So at first, I was ready to immediately give Tears of the Kingdom the win here. I mean, Breath of the Wild's dungeons were nice and all, but they all looked somewhat the same, as did their bosses. But then I remembered that the lightning boss was pretty fun, and the puzzles for each divine beast were actually okay. I don't think there was a dungeon I specifically disliked. They were all basically just average. Then when I thought of Tears, well, I liked the thunder and wind temples. I mean, how could you not like jumping on the ship's sails? I can't really say the same about the water and fire temples. The water temple was just kind of forgettable, to be honest, though its boss was okay. The fire temple had good ideas, but those last couple terminals made up about 50% of my time there, and that boss was pretty annoying. Not to mention Master Yunobo was a complete pushover. Then you have the Construct Factory, which is so average that I keep forgetting it's an actual dungeon. That being said, I will say that I'm glad that all these bosses couldn't be cheesed like before. So on one hand, we have a bunch of perfectly fine bosses and dungeons, and on the other have temples which, while aesthetically better, vary in quality. I can't even say the sages are hands down better. Though I will say that Simon and Tulin have the fastest character arcs I've ever seen. It's pretty impressive, actually. This category is a bit difficult for me to definitively judge because I was not one of those people that scoured Breath's world for hundreds of hours, and naturally, the same goes for Tears. But that arguably made the repeated use of it less bothersome for me. I knew it well enough to notice the differences, but not enough to feel tired of the same forts and ruins as before. That being said, I don't know if this is an unpopular opinion, but the Sky Islands were probably more disappointing for me. A lot of them were big enough for a single puzzle, which usually amounted to delivering a shrine crystal. There were definitely some fun moments to be had, but I guess I just expected them to be bigger and feel more like the tutorial island. I wanted to explore ancient Zonai buildings and ruins, not fight a couple dozen flux constructs. To be fair, there were a couple fun islands here or there, but I do feel like the concept as a whole was underutilized. And let's not talk about the sky mazes. Well, luckily, Tears gave us more than just the sky. Completely unexpected by me, there was an entire underground map too. And I know some people say this map can feel empty, and they're not entirely wrong, but there's just something so fun about starting in complete darkness before slowly lighting the place up, one small patch at a time. And I love the genius design choice to make each light route mark a shrine up above. So that means if you're shrine hunting, you can just look wherever there's a light route, and vice versa. I also love how you can just randomly stumble upon a talus or a Phrox down here, and if you're especially lucky, you might even find a dungeon boss. When you first enter this place with only a handful of hearts, it's kinda terrifying, especially when you realize that gloom creatures break your heart containers. But then once you've powered up, it becomes really fun to go spelunking for Zonite as you fill out your map. So to conclude this section, I can't really say one did the world better than the other. If the sky map was just as expansive as the underground, I don't think there would be much of an argument. But the lackluster islands, combined with the fact that Breath of the Wild made the world Tears is based on, prevents me from saying one is definitively better than the other. Tears of the Kingdom wins this one. I think one of the biggest problems people had with Breath of the Wild was its ending. Doing the 4 main dungeons already reduced Ganon to half health, then ensued an alright boss fight, before basically a playable cinematic. Tears' fight is pretty brutal. I reached Ganon with max hearts, and after several attempts, I managed to eke out a win with 1 heart remaining. Not only that, but the presentation is on point. We already knew this fight would be dangerous after the confrontation in the castle, but when you see Ganon start flurry rushing you, and then you see the health bar extend past its boundary, you know you're in for something special. Not to mention the playable cinematic is pretty cool. There's really no contest. Alright, let's just tie up a few loose ends. First of all, Koroks. Breath of the Wild wins here for sure. I wasn't a fan of them to begin with, but now that you have to put 5 to 10 minutes of work in for just 2 seeds, it meant that I actively ignored them. The signposts were pretty fun though. I liked how each sign was a little different with its shape and terrain, so it wasn't too much of a mindless activity. I also won't give a point to Tears here, but just seeing the world advance with Lookout Landing being built, Tarrytown developing, and Tetano Village becoming an eyesore, it really builds on what Breath established. And lastly, shout out to Nintendo for somehow matching the Terror of Guardians with the Gloom Spawn. Seriously, how's this game not rated T? Those things would have terrified me as a kid. Alright, so now it's time for the ultimate question. Which is better? Well, as I've already stated, that's not really a fair question, because with so much taken from its older sibling, it's hard to judge what Tears of the Kingdom did better. But we can ask how good Tears of the Kingdom is as a sequel. And outside of the expanded world being a bit disappointing sometimes, I think it's about as good as one could reasonably expect. The biggest problem is that after 6 years of development, expectations were through the roof, and people were expecting to be hit with the same effect as they were with Breath of the Wild. But I honestly don't think that those expectations could ever truly be met. That is a trouble, after all, with making a direct sequel. Obviously, Tears has problems, as did Breath of the Wild, but I think it depends on what you like about that game. If it was the exploration and the overall vibe, you were probably at least slightly disappointed. If it was the combat or shrines, you probably liked this one more. And as someone in that latter camp, as well as someone who thought Breath's story was a bit lacking, I just so happen to like Tears of the Kingdom more, at least for now. That being said, I think there's an appeal to having that more overpowered kit and having an overall simpler game. Well, that and you can ride a motorcycle. When I was in the middle of playing Tears, I thought there was basically zero chance I would go back to Breath of the Wild. But now that I've had some time away from it, I can definitely see myself going back in the future. So let me know which one you prefer. Until next time, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.